Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibis? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Hope you're having a good Monday wherever you are in this crazy world. Spent my weekend organizing and decluttering. And it's one of those things where you put it off. And then when you finally do it, you feel so good. So my plan is to do one room a day. But y'all ask me in a month how far I am on that. Sometimes my ambitions are way too high. Music fact of the day. Elton John has released 31 albums throughout the course of his career. And actually, 12 of those were released in the 70s. In fact, in the early 70s, he was releasing as many as 2 albums per year. In 1972, Honky Chateau, which produced the hit Rocket Man, was released. 1973, Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano Player, which gave us Daniel, a great, great song. And then Goodbye Yellow Brick Road was released. That had the song of the same title, Candle in the Wind, Benny and the Jets. Love me some Elton John. I've seen him 4 times in concert. I really wanted to catch him on his farewell tour, but man, you'd have to sell a kidney. I mean, the nosebleed sections were $2,000 and $3,000. If you're on YouTube, don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe. If you're not subscribed, just a few clicks of the mouse really helps my channel to grow, so I do appreciate it very much. We are going to continue on our deep dive of Ellen Greenberg, and today we're going to do the deposition of Dr. Marlon Osbourne, who was the medical examiner, and we've talked about how initially, the day after she was killed, his findings were this was a homicide. This is one of those cases that every time I'm reading through these documents, I'll just stop and kind of absorb the fact that this is ruled a suicide, with every single medical professional, other than the powers that be in Philadelphia, saying there's no way. This was absolutely a homicide. Let's dive into this. This deposition was due to a civil suit filed by Ellen Greenberg's parents against Dr. Osbourne. He had an attorney present with him, and that attorney represented not only Dr. Osbourne, but also the City of Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office. He said he reviewed the packet that included the complaints and the exhibits, as well as the investigative report and autopsy photos. Dr. Osbourne went to medical school at Rutgers Medical School in New Jersey. He completed his residency in pathology in 2004. He was employed by the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office from 2009 until 2014. From there, he went to the Broward County Medical Examiner's Office in 2014, stayed there until 2019, where he moved to the Palm Beach County Medical Examiner's Office, where he is currently employed. In fact, he was associated with the Parkland school shooting autopsies. His first involvement in Ellen's case was the morning after her death on January 27th. He was briefed on the scene investigation. We could say lack thereof. There was not an investigation of this scene done, according to anybody who's reviewed this. He was told the deceased was a female found in the kitchen area of her apartment with several stab wounds to her chest. The investigator said he got information from Ellen's boyfriend that when he returned home from going to the gym, he couldn't get in the door because the security latch was still engaged from the inside. When he opened the door, he saw Ellen on the ground. Dr. Osbourne said he was informed of the investigator's examination of her body at the scene, and he was also given photographs. He's asked if there's anything remarkable about the autopsy, and he said several posterior aspects of the neck had stab wounds. There was bruising noted on the arms, the hand and the wrist area, and the thighs, all in different stages of healing. The knife that was stuck in her chest from the time she was discovered was removed, packaged, and given to the police as evidence. They photographed the body and then they proceed with the internal examination. According to him, the internal exam showed the final blow, the stab wound to the chest, had damaged the heart, the lungs, and the liver. The majority of the stab wounds to the back of the neck were shallow and only went through skin and muscle. One did go through the ligament that connects between the first cervical vertebrae and the base of the skull. He said the brain did have some subarachnoid hemorrhage. There was one wound to the posterior neck that went through the disc of the, and he says, between the second and third vertebrae and incised the covering that covered the spinal cord in that area, which is called the dura. The spinal cord in that area appeared to be bulging from that defect. There was a large amount of blood removed from the chest cavity. He said, at my examination of the neck, it did not show any significant injury or hemorrhage. There was no damage to the hyoid bone or the thyroid cartilage which would indicate manual strangulation, although we did have an expert where their opinion was he missed signs of strangulation. All other organs, the person who was doing this deposition told him, you have a pretty good recollection, and Dr. Osbourne said that he refreshed by reviewing the documentation. He said he isn't sure if the investigator shared with him knowledge of the posterior wounds. Dr. Osbourne is asked if he would have expected the investigator to have included the neck wounds in his report if the investigator was aware of them, and he said yes. What's interesting to me is every time I've watched the first 48 Forensic Files or any show that deals with a possible homicide, you wait until the medical examiner or the coroner comes and moves the body to look for other wounds. These neck wounds weren't discovered until the next day. All they saw was the knife in her chest. And that's why, according to police, along with that door being latched and no footprints, is how they concluded that she had done this to herself. Nobody from the medical examiner's office moved her body to look for additional wounds at the scene. I wonder, had they seen the neck wounds, would they have been so sure it was self-inflicted? And the answer probably is yes, because none of this makes sense. So they probably didn't want to find anything that would make it look like something other than self-inflicted. He's asked what his conclusion was at the end of the autopsy as far as cause and manner of death, and he said homicide. Dr. Osbourne said at the time that was correct. He says it was amended to suicide, and he's asked if he was confident at the time, based on the information available to him, that the determination of homicide was within a certain degree of medical certainty. He said, at the time of autopsy, I did believe I had enough information to make that determination. He's asked to walk the interviewer through how he came to amend the manner of death. He said, following his determination of homicide, the police were notified. I was then notified that they were continuing their investigation. He said, although I had, from my own investigation of the spinal cord, thought the injury was, or there was an injury to the spinal cord, I was not certain. Well, you just did the autopsy. How can you not be certain whether or not there's an injury to the spinal cord? He said, I consulted with other associates and decided it should be looked at by a neuropathologist. And additionally, when it's a non-natural death, toxicology is performed. So with those things outlying and the police's request and knowing they were going to continue their investigation, the case was made pending until all further information could be gathered and revisited to determine the manner of death. He's asked when he asked to have the spinal cord evaluated after his determination of homicide or manner of death. He said it was within days then he said it was likely days to a week or two. He's asked what prompted him to have that spinal cord examined. He said, again, I was not 100% certain there was an actual injury to the spinal cord, which the question would be, would Ellen not be able to continue to inflict injury to herself because of this injury? According to him, Dr. Rourke was consulted. The person leading the deposition says now, Dr. Galino talked about a meeting with the police and a representative from the DA's office. He's asked if he remembers a meeting after he determined the manner of death to be a homicide. He said he remembered it happened after the case was made pending and there was more information gathered. The meeting happened after he supposedly consulted with Dr. Rourke. He's asked if there were other meetings involving the police and the DA other than Ellen's case. He said he only recalls one meeting with the police and the DA after he gathered information and they presented the information they gathered to the best of his knowledge. They ask after the meeting with the police and the DA, what was new information he gathered that wasn't present at the time of death, at the time he determined homicide as a manner of death. He responded, the information that was gathered was that we had the information Dr. Rourke's evaluation had been done. In an email about the case on July 12th, 2018, Lucy Rourke responded to PhillyNews.com that there is no neuropathology report in the file, no record that she charged for the exam, and she said, I would conclude that I did not see the specimen in question, although there is a remote possibility that it was shown to me. However, I have no recollection of such a case. Not fishy at all, is it, y'all? The investigation gave a lot of weight into what she allegedly said about her findings with the spinal cord. According to Dr. Osbourne and everybody else in Philadelphia that had their hand in this case, was that she said that would not have incapacitated Ellen, and she would have been able to continue stabbing herself. This is a devastating injury. I've got a graphic that's coming up in just a minute where we can revisit just how severe this injury was. I mean, we don't even know now if she examined the spinal cord at all. And that was a big part of the determination of self-harm as opposed to homicide that he originally put down. But it all fits within everybody's speculation that there's something more nefarious at play here. He said the toxicology, I believe, had been reported by that time. Additionally, I'd already had the chance to review psychiatric records that we requested that I wasn't able to review before the autopsy was performed and go through the scene investigation report that was completed and review scene photographs completely. He said, I believe that's the majority. That's all the things I brought to the meeting. He's asked, what did the police or representatives from the DA office present? He said, to my knowledge, they discussed their interactions with Ellen's boyfriend and the statements that he gave. They also stated they were going to be evaluating the knife. I'm not sure that the dating evidence was available at the time because I can't place exactly what happened and the sequence of events. I knew that in their investigation at that point, they were going to be testing the knife for DNA. They never tested it for fingerprints or anything. He said they went through the entire scene again to discuss what factors would contribute. What factors are associated with or led to homicide versus when he determined it was suicide. He lists those who were in attendance in the meeting that day. He said it was himself, Dr. Galino, 2 officers, and the DA, who he believes was named Ann. He's asked, this is very interesting. Prior to this meeting, had you had any similar meetings with police and or DA representatives to discuss the changing of the manner of death from homicide to suicide? He said, I spoke to the investigating officers when they requested it be changed. When they requested the case be changed to pending while they continued their investigation, he said he doesn't remember the officer's name who suggested that. The interviewer says her question was more general. Up to January 27th of 2011, had you any similar meetings with representatives from the PD and the DA's office to discuss changing the manner of death from homicide to suicide in any case before Ellen's? His answer, no, I have not had a meeting to discuss changing. He's asked, would you agree with me that suicide is not a default determination simply when you feel a homicide hasn't occurred? When you were doing your autopsy and taking in all this information, you were determining whether there was proof of a homicide, correct? He said, I was determining how and under what circumstances these injuries could have occurred. There are 5 manners of death: natural, accident, homicide, suicide, or undetermined. He's asked, when considering the homicide choice versus suicide, was it your thought that concluding one or excluding one by default meant the other? He says, I don't understand. They rephrase, before suicide is selected, you have to sufficiently prove in your mind that it's a suicide, correct? He says, you have to have circumstantial, and then he says, circumstances and findings to support that. Yes. He's then asked, I've heard folks say before you decide the manner of death is a homicide, you have to prove homicide from your investigation, both from the autopsy as well as other information that's available. Do you agree? He said, in general terms, yes, I agree with that statement. Then, and in determining suicide before that manner of death is designated that needs to be proven through the autopsy as well as other information that is gathered, do you agree? He says, in general terms, yes. He's then asked, if there's doubt as to proof of homicide or suicide or any of the manners of death compared to the default would be to indicate cannot be determined or investigation continuing to try to unearth further information. Would you agree? He said, before you come to the conclusion of cannot be determined, all information needs to be, or all information that can possibly be gathered has to be evaluated. Then you come to the conclusion that you can't decide between 2 manners and or you don't have enough information to make that determination. If you're not certain at the time of autopsy, you would make the case pending until you get that information or have exhausted all ways of getting that information in order to make the determination either a distinct manner or you cannot make a distinction between the 2, and then you call it undetermined. The next question, and with all that information now made available, does not enable you to feel comfortable that you can prove one against the other, then the determination would be investigation pending or manner of death cannot be determined at this time. Is that correct? He said pending is just, and then he says it's used when you're gathering information. It's not a definitive cause of death or manner of death. I'm sorry, that would never be a definitive manner of death. And you would end up, if you can't decide between one or more manners, two or more manners, then you would call it undetermined. The interviewer says, let's go over the death investigation report. They asked if the synopsis on the screen was the one available to him prior to starting the autopsy on January 27th of 2011. He says just the first paragraph. I do not believe the scene investigation was fully completed at the time of before I started the autopsy. I believe some of the information was given to me verbally. If you remember, on the 27th, that crime scene was cleared. The office manager, Melissa, was told she could have that unit professionally cleaned, and they even suggested a company that she might call. Also, Sam's uncle came in and took some of Ellen's belongings out of the house. That was turned over super quick. Next question, what was supplied to you at the time of autopsy? He said, I believe I answered that generally the scene was explained to me as the medical examiner investigator had approached it. The information he got from doing his scene investigation were the wounds to the torso of the deceased were identified. Her status of clothing was relayed to me, the door, and the story given by the boyfriend about having to break down the door. A general description of the scene investigation, which is consistent with the investigation report. Next question, and that would have been at the time of your autopsy, or more significantly, prior to your determination of the manner of death being a homicide? He said yes. Starting where it says psychiatrist Dr. Ellen, what if that information was shared with you prior to your determination that the manner of death was a homicide? He said, I'm not certain any particular information was shared with me prior to determining homicide. I don't recall knowing those details before determining or making the determination of homicide. You mentioned investigator Oshesky. I hope I pronounced that right. If you go to the first page of this, it identifies Jamie Budd as the investigator. Who is Jamie Budd? He says Jamie Budd was also an investigator at the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office. Mr. Oshesky is the actual investigator who went to the scene. So then they clarify there's only one investigator who went to the scene. He says yes. Budd also appears on this document because she began the generation of this document. And he said, yes, she is the investigator who received the call. Before you determined the manner of death, did you have an understanding of how the scene was going to be maintained by the police department? He says, I don't know that I knew that information. Would you expect that before the determination of manner of death is made, that the scene is maintained to keep it from being polluted? He says, that's up to police discretion on a case-by-case basis. For our purposes, that's why we have our investigator go to the scene, take photos, examine the body, and collect that information for us to evaluate, except they didn't examine the back of her neck. Additionally, we may, or at times, we do use additional information provided by the police from their photos to the scene investigation, but we're not solely relying on that. Are you aware if a forensic division, homicide, or other division actually examined the scene? He said, for all scenes, there's always an investigator or detective homicide detective presence. And in this case, I believe Mr. Oshesky's report, it was Detective Sierra and Peters as the homicide detectives. Police are at the scene when our staff is there. The examiner says, my question was a little more pointed. Are you aware of whether there was ever a forensic examination done by the Philadelphia Police Department for that scene? He says, I don't recall that specific information. I would likely believe they would have some kind of investigation of that matter. He's asked, do you recall meeting with the Philadelphia Police Department and a representative from the DA's office of information obtained by the police department based on its forensic examination of the premises? He said, I do not recall specific information from a forensic investigation at that point. I don't specifically recall being told a forensic examination had been done. I do not have at this time, or have not reviewed at this time, any investigations by the police generated from the report. So at this time, I can't recall. He said a pathologist did not examine her body at the scene before being brought into the morgue. He did say it's not the role of the police to do that. He's asked about the police concluding a manner of death on scene. Dr. Osbourne said only the medical examiner can make a determination of the manner of death. Individuals at the scene may infer what type of case they're dealing with and call it a homicide, suicide, accident, based on the scene that they approached and how they interpreted it. She asks him to look at wound T. He confirms that the dura, which is the covering around the spinal cord, was cut and agrees that this wound would have been very painful. When asked if it could have been an incapacitating wound, he said he doesn't know if he can make that determination. Is this not a medical examiner, isn't that your job to determine whether or not this would be incapacitating? It seems like you're the guy to make that determination. When pressed, if under proper circumstances, if a cut to the dura could incapacitate a person, he said it may. Yes. So then they move on to unconsciousness if the dura is cut. And he said, I don't know if I could answer that definitively, yes or no. Then he's asked about the effect of blood pressure. And he said it can affect blood pressure and a loss of cerebral spinal fluid. So this results in something called intracranial hypotension, potentially, when you're talking about an injury to that dura. We know the dura is that covering on the spinal cord. It's kind of like a little sleeve that goes right over it to protect our spinal cord. But intracranial hypotension is caused by a cerebral spinal fluid leak. Cerebral spinal fluid, now that's made in the ventricles of the brain and absorbed into the bloodstream. That's what cushions our brain. When the amount of cerebral spinal fluid is reduced, the brain sags in the skull instead of floating. What are the symptoms of that? Potential headaches that worsens when sitting up, nausea and or vomiting, light sensitivity, neck pain and stiffness, hearing changes, difficulty concentrating, dizziness, imbalance and double vision, and or memory impairment. All the things that would allow her to keep stabbing herself, right? He said he never attempted to recreate the wounds that Ellen suffered. Then he's asked, did you do anything to physically determine that Ellen could physically administer each of the wounds? He said, to my knowledge, in my opinion, I don't believe there was any reason, but for the fact she would have been incapacitated, she would not have been able to do so. Then the interviewer said, but you did nothing beyond simply believing that? In other words, you took no steps to support it through analysis or beyond, and he said no. He's asked, you never took the knife and attempted to see what angles it would be at and whether the length of Ellen's arms or fingers would facilitate such a wound. He said, I did not do that. He's asked, if there was a wound Ellen could not physically do, this could not then be a suicide as a manner of death? He said, if that could be absolutely proven. I don't exactly know how you would do that, though, to prove the fact. The interviewer says, I'm not asking that. If it could be proven that one or more of the wounds Ellen sustained could not have been inflicted by her, then would you agree the manner of death as suicide would be improper and incorrect? He said, it would just mean she, then there's a pause, and he said, I would have to agree. Crazy stuff, y'all. On the next episode, we are going to keep going on this deposition, and I really just want to take my time with it to make sure that we're getting it all out there, doing a deep dive. We're going deep. Now, it may not be tomorrow. It just depends on what happens with the other cases that we're covering. So we have a lot to go yet in this deep dive. Now, on October the 30th, Caitlin Armstrong's trial is starting. That is supposed to be live streamed. I'm planning on doing my daily updates for that to bring you the best in testimony at the end of every day in an hour or less. So those of you who have no desire or no time to watch an 8-hour live streamed court day, I got you covered. So hopefully I'll have this finished before we get to Caitlin Armstrong. But that's it for today. We're just going to end it here because it gets kind of deeper and deeper. And then we have the deposition of Dr. Galino coming up, as well as some others. Until next time, hope you guys have a good rest of your day. We'll see you soon.